Hello and welcome to a musical review. You may feel as if you have a good grasp of musical concepts and ideas. But if you were to walk into another musical culture, would you know their building blocks of their musical society? Would you know how they are first introduced to instruments? What do they learn first? Do they name notes? Do they learn to read music on a staff, or is music passed down orally? From one person to the next, one generation to the next, teaching the other, without any music that's actually ever transcribed onto a piece of paper or a computer. Is that how their musical culture works? And would you all of a sudden be lost? Even if you had ground yourself in every theory, concept you could in Western music, would you still feel lost? Most likely, you'd have a basic understanding of concepts like rhythm and whether or not they have a key signature and a tonal center that they go back to, or whether or not they make music that's more atonal. Would there be modes and other things mixed in, things that you're not used to hearing? Would your ear have to adapt because things that you've always thought were wrong musically all of a sudden are part of this other musical culture and landscape? The answer is probably yes. If I said to you, what is a key? You'd say a key on a keyboard or a key signature. And yes, more the idea of a key signature. And a key signature is a collection of notes with what we call a tonal center or a tonic, a note that is always referred back to over and over again. So if you're in the key of C, it doesn't mean that the only note you can include is C, obviously. Music has to have other parts, but it always returns back to this idea of C. It would be kind of silly if the music only was on C, but with rhythm you can make things interesting. But if you add another note in, all of a sudden you have this tension release idea, and that's what happens, is that music builds off of this tension release as it moves. And then it settles back into C. But you could have another tonal center. G could be your tonal center. But if C is your tonal center and your tonic here, you would think, okay, so if I know my key signatures, it's been like ground into me over and over and over again. In the key of C, there's no sharps and no flats. That doesn't mean, though, that in the key of C you can't have extra notes. You could start on D, F, and A. You could have a C sharp. You could have an E flat, and you could add in other notes, and you could kind of experiment around with different things, and you could stay all the way away from C until the end. And then you could land on C. And that's about 200 garbled notes before we actually get to C, the tonic. So it's not as if C has to be there the entire time, but there's always this tension and release that's pushing or pulling us towards that tonal center. Scales are just a pattern of intervals, and there's lots of them. There's major, and there's three types of minor scales, and then there's what we call scale modes, which are major scales shifted or just different patterns of intervals back to back. So in C major, we have a major second, a major second, a minor second, major second, major second, major second, minor second. So we call these whole tones and half tones, or semitones and whole tones. So C to C sharp clashes. C to D is a whole tone. It still clashes. And this is the first steps of our major scale. Then we have, again, another major second. And then we have our first minor second, semitone here. Semitones are what really establishes a tonal center. They help pull you back to somewhere. And so the last semitone is B to C. And that helps resolve us back into a key signature. So scales often function with patterns. And so that pattern exists everywhere. If you start on G, you have a second, so a whole tone, half tone, or semitone, whole tone, whole tone, and the very last set is a semitone or half tone there, and it resolves. And you all of a sudden establish G as your tonal center. But you could have a minor scale, and a minor scale just shifts where some of those steps are. So whole tone, and then instead of another whole tone, we put a semitone earlier, or a half step, and then a whole tone. And then we have 3 different options here. It could be this, which is minor, natural minor. Or we could shift the 7th note, and we have what's called harmonic, which we're very used to hearing in music. And then we have melodic minor, which actually raises the 6th and 7th on the way up and lowers it on the way down. So it would sound like a natural minor. And learning to identify each of those things is important. The octave, as I've already said, C can be played at multiple places, as can G. And notes are octaves because the frequency at which they are alternating, so notes actually, when you play them, create sound waves that vibrate, and a C that is an octave above vibrates twice as quickly, and one that is an octave below is twice as slowly. So that's where you get into the physicsy side of things, and it's kind of just like light. We have what are called chords and triads. So this is kind of similar to math, where you have squares and rectangles, and they're kind of all categorized under a similar category, but based on the shape and size of them, they are classified differently. So we have here 2 notes, and this is an interval. And then if we add a 3rd note, this is a triad, but it's also a chord. So at the point at which we have triads are chords, but any other additional notes are still versions of chords. That's a chord. That's a chord. Still a chord. We could play even more notes. It's a chord. It's some version of a chord. A chord is just a collection of notes, and you learn to name them, you learn to play them, you learn to break them up. And all of a sudden they become a very important part of music, whether or not they're solid or broken. And you can shift some of the notes there, and it creates very different results overall. So triads are 3 notes collected together. Chords are 3 or more notes. It could be a ton of notes. It could be 4 notes. Any collection of notes that is 3 or greater is a chord. Passing notes, neighbor tones, these are really interesting. So these are the notes that help us create musical motion. So if we have C here, what we have is we have these notes in between. So if we're just going to play C, 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 it's kind of boring. But if instead we add notes in between, we have things like this. So we have what are called stable tones and active tones. So here's a stable tone. And then our active tones are the ones that want to move. That's active. It wants to go somewhere. Stable. Wants to go somewhere. Stable. Active. Active. Stable. And so passing tones are when you have a chord or something, and then a note that doesn't fit that's moving to resolve somewhere. So these are all part of it. And this F here, you can hear if I play F, B, C again, is resolving towards that C. And so all of this music has to do with tension release, and it's the fundamentals. As you learn to play with, work with tension release, your music will start to come alive, because people have expectations in music. There's things we learn to hear that we anticipate, and when someone goes against that, it can either yield a very interesting positive result, or it can be quite negative in nature overall if someone's not expecting something. So if I've been playing this for you the whole time, you're expecting things like this. You're not expecting things like this. It doesn't resolve back to C because there's something missing. And it can really play with your ear as new musical material is introduced, and learning to play subtly with changes in music and make the tension release work is a fine art, but you always just start basic. You don't have to try and add in every single accidental key that you can. It can have an interesting effect, but it's not necessarily a very easy way to start. Using accidentals in music is a very powerful way to either move towards another tonal key center, even if it's just temporarily, or it can be a way to add in additional interest and movement. So, for instance, if we're in the key of C, which is the easiest for explaining some of these theory concepts, if we added in an F sharp, it would clash. But it also resolves towards G. So it helps create this additional interest. So instead of just having so I played initially C, F, G, C, but if instead I go C, F sharp, G, C, it all of a sudden makes us think, oh, is G about to be the tonal center? And then we hit G, but G resolves quickly back to C, and all of a sudden our expectations have kind of been played with a little bit. We didn't know what to expect, which made us listen in a different way, and that's important. I want to talk about modes just for a moment. There's 7 diatonic modes. Modes are just versions of scales. So C major is actually called Ionian. If we were to play all the same notes, so the exact same pattern of things, but move up to D, so no sharps or flats are added, we have what's called Dorian. If we go to the next scale degree up, E, we have what's called Phrygian. Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, which is also our natural minor, and perhaps the most odd one is the Locrian on the 7th scale degree. Why these are difficult for us to hear right away until they're used in music is because those intervals that are being shifted around normally help us resolve back to what is the Ionian scale. But in other musical cultures and in musical styles that have become part of Western musical cultural tradition too, there's this idea of not always using those intervals to resolve back, but resolve so those like small semitones to resolve back to C, but instead just creating something else as the tonal center that you always move back towards, and your ear starts to adjust to the different chords as they progress there. And sometimes it can be quite beautiful. Dorian is used quite often, and it has this very sweet, soothing sound to it. Lydian has a little bit of a jarring sound to it, but it sounds as if there is very much a cultural shift that is happening. Aeolian is used very often in songwriting ideas where someone doesn't want to actually raise the seventh. So scale modes are really interesting to play around with because they allow you a whole new palette to create with in very quick succession without a lot of change. You just have to really ground your main note as something else, not resolving back to C and learning to play with chords that sound different than we're used to hearing.